You've lost your spark, Helena. I need someone who inspires me again. The words hit me like ice water on a winter morning. 22 years of marriage, 22 years of building dreams together, building a life brick by brick, reduced to this single moment of devastating cruelty in our living room. I was standing by the window watching the rain streak down the glass when he delivered his verdict. The same window where I'd stood countless mornings watching him leave for work, planning our days, our future, our retirement together. The irony wasn't lost on me that this was where it would all end. He didn't even have the decency to look ashamed. His hands were steady as he poured himself a drink, our good whiskey, the bottle we'd been saving for our 25th anniversary. Even in destruction, he helped himself to what was ours. His inspiration was 25 years old. Isabella Rodriguez. Long hair that caught the light like silk, a practiced smile that had probably charmed professors and employers alike, and absolutely no idea what real love costs. She had never built anything from nothing, never sacrificed sleep for someone else's dreams, never held a man's hand through his darkest moments while her own world was falling apart. But she made him feel young again. She laughed at his jokes, probably found his stories fascinating, looked at him like he was still the man he'd been 20 years ago instead of the middle-aged reality he'd become. And apparently, that temporary illusion was worth throwing away everything we had created together. I remember thinking, in that moment, how small he looked, how ordinary. This man I'd built my entire adult life around, who'd seemed so important, so central to my existence, was just a middle-aged man having a predictable crisis. The worst part? He took half our company with him. Meridian Holdings, the business I had helped build from nothing, working 16-hour days, missing dinners, missing friends' weddings, missing life because I believed we were partners in every sense of the word. I'd used my inheritance from my grandmother to provide the initial capital. I'd designed the logo. I'd named the company after my mother's maiden name, and he was walking away with half of it like it was just another asset to be divided. "You can't be serious," I said, my voice surprisingly steady. I turned from the window to face him, and I saw it in his eyes. He'd already checked out. This conversation was just a formality for him. "I've never been more serious in my life," he replied, loosening his tie like the weight of our marriage had been choking him. "We've grown apart, Helena. You know it. I know it. We're just different people now. Different people. As if people don't change and grow together. As if that wasn't the entire point of marriage. To evolve side by side, to become better versions of yourselves through partnership." Everyone expected me to crumble. My sister called within an hour of the news spreading, and news travels fast in our circle of friends. She arrived with tissues and wine, expecting to find me destroyed, sobbing, probably still in my bathrobe. "Oh, honey," she said, pulling me into a hug I didn't want. "I'm so sorry. I know this must be devastating." My friends waited for the breakdown calls, the public scenes, the desperate attempts to win him back. They whispered about poor Helena at dinner parties, wondering how I'd survive this humiliation. How would I manage financially? Emotionally? Socially? Margaret from book club actually said to me, "You know, Helena, maybe this is a blessing in disguise. You can focus on yourself now." As if I hadn't been focusing on building something meaningful for 2 decades. But they didn't know me. Not really. They knew Helena, the wife, Helena, the partner. Helena, who always brought homemade desserts to gatherings. They didn't know Helena the strategist, Helena who read Forbes and Harvard Business Review, Helena who had her own investment portfolio that she'd never talked about. While he paraded his young trophy around town, I saw them at restaurants, at the theater, at our old haunts like he was marking his territory, while she posted their perfect photos on social media with captions about new adventures and finding happiness, while everyone pitied the discarded wife. I was working, in silence, with purpose, with the precision of a woman, who understands that revenge isn't a dish best served hot. It's best served calculated, planned, and executed with surgical precision. Each silent tear was an act of resistance. Each moment of underestimation became my advantage. Every pitying glance, every whispered conversation, every assumption that I was finished. It all became fuel for what I was planning. At 48, I had learned something that 25 cannot teach. A woman's power doesn't fade with age. It sharpens. It becomes strategic. It learns patience. It understands that real strength isn't in the immediate reaction. It's in the long game. I didn't come into this world to be invisible. I came to leave my mark, even when they tried to erase my existence. My voice is my weapon, my story, my revolution. When they told me I was finished, I was just beginning. When they tried to silence me, I prepared to speak louder, not with words, but with actions that would echo through boardrooms and dinner parties for years to come. Because true strength isn't in screaming. It's in surviving with dignity, and then thriving beyond anyone's expectations. The first week after he left, I sat in our empty house and did something that would have surprised everyone who thought they knew me. I made a list, not of what I'd lost, though the temptation was there, not of what hurt, though everything did, but of what I still had. My shares in 3 companies, including the 20% stake in a tech startup that had been my private investment. My network of contacts from 22 years in business. People who knew my work ethic, my strategic mind, my ability to deliver results. My reputation as someone who could be trusted with confidential information and complex negotiations. And most importantly, my intelligence. Sharpened by decades of experience, refined by years of managing budgets, reading markets, understanding what made businesses succeed or fail. But first, I had to grieve. Not for him. I'd realized within days that I was mourning the man I thought he was, not the man he actually turned out to be. Was grieving for the future I'd planned, the dreams we'd shared, the certainty that had been the foundation of my adult life. I allowed myself exactly 1 week to feel sorry for myself. 1 week to cry in the shower, to eat ice cream for breakfast, to ignore phone calls from well-meaning friends. 1 week to feel the full weight of what it means to have your entire life's work dismissed as insufficient. Then I got to work. While my friends brought casseroles and tissues, expecting me to fall apart, I was making phone calls. Quiet ones, strategic ones, to financial advisors who'd known me for years, to business contacts who remembered deals I'd facilitated, to women who'd broken glass ceilings and understood what it meant to rebuild from scratch. I'm looking to diversify my investments, I told each contact, my voice steady and professional. Something stable with growth potential. I'm thinking about taking a more active role in business ownership. They thought I was trying to secure my future after the divorce. A smart woman planning ahead, making sure she wouldn't be left financially vulnerable. They had no idea I was preparing for war. The hardest part wasn't the planning, it was the acting. Pretending to be the broken woman everyone expected me to be. Letting them see me as fragile, defeated, financially dependent on what little he'd left me after the lawyers finished dividing our assets. At dinner parties, the few I still attended, I played the role perfectly. The sad, abandoned wife who spoke in quiet tones about starting over and finding herself. The woman who'd given her best years to an ungrateful man and was now lost without his direction. I watched their pitying glances, heard their whispered conversations about how I'd never recover from this. How difficult it must be to start over at my age. How challenging the modern dating scene would be for someone like me. Cynthia Morrison, whose husband owned a chain of restaurants, actually patted my hand during book club and said, "You know, Helena, my cousin went back to school at 50 and became a nurse. It's never too late to find a new purpose." A new purpose. As if building and managing businesses hadn't been purpose enough. But every night, alone in my study, the room he'd never paid attention to, dismissing it as my little office, I worked. I researched. I calculated. I planned. His new company was Meridian Holdings. The irony wasn't lost on me. It was a name I'd suggested years ago for a business venture we'd considered. Now he was working there as senior vice president, earning a substantial salary, probably telling Isabella about his executive position and his business acumen. Meridian was struggling. Not failing, but not thriving either. The kind of mid-sized company that had good bones but needed better management, fresh capital, and strategic direction. The kind of business that would welcome a serious investor with open arms and few questions. I spent hours studying their financial reports, their market position, their competition. I analyzed their board structure, their ownership distribution, their decision-making processes. I became an expert on a company that didn't know I existed. I sold my jewelry, pieces he'd given me over the years, each one carrying memories I no longer wanted to preserve. The diamond earrings from our 10th anniversary brought in $15,000. The emerald necklace from our trip to Ireland added another $8,000. Each sale felt like shedding old skin, preparing for rebirth. I cashed in my retirement funds, accepting the penalties because I was investing in a different kind of future. I liquidated stock options I'd accumulated over the years. I called in favors from investment partners who owed me from previous deals. Every sacrifice felt purposeful. Every loss was strategic. My lawyer, David Chen, thought I was having a breakdown. Helena, you need to be more careful with your finances. Think about your future. You're making some very aggressive moves for someone in your position. My position. The divorced woman, the abandoned wife, the person everyone assumed was acting from emotion rather than strategy. I appreciate your concern, David, I told him during one of our meetings. But I know exactly what I'm doing. If only he knew what I was thinking about. If only any of them knew. The beautiful thing about being underestimated is how invisible it makes you. How freely people talk around someone they assume is powerless. How careless they become with information when they think you're not a threat. Through mutual friends, through casual conversations, through the small-town nature of our business community, I learned about their plans. His promotion timeline. Her career ambitions. Where they saw themselves in 5 years. I was going to make sure they never got there. Not through destruction, through control. Because the most elegant revenge isn't burning someone's house down. It's buying the neighborhood and becoming their landlord. Minha voz é minha arma. Minha Historia. Minha revolução. When they told me I couldn't, I proved I could. When they tried to silence me, I prepared to speak louder. Not with words, but with actions that would reshape their entire world. 3 months. That's how long it took to buy controlling interest in Meridian Holdings. Longer than I'd hoped. Shorter than I'd feared. Every day of those 3 months was a masterclass in patience, in playing a role, in appearing to be something I wasn't while methodically executing a plan that would change everything. The acquisition wasn't simple. Meridian wasn't publicly traded, so I couldn't just buy shares on the open market. I had to be creative, strategic, and above all, invisible until the moment I was ready to reveal myself. I started by approaching smaller shareholders, people who owned 2 to 3% stakes, usually employees who'd been given equity as part of compensation packages over the years. I presented myself as a recently divorced woman looking to invest her settlement money wisely, interested in being a silent partner in a stable business. The story sold itself. Who would suspect that a heartbroken ex-wife was planning a corporate takeover? Mrs. Patterson, who owned 3% from her late husband's employment there, actually offered me tea and sympathy along with her shares. "You're so brave, dear," she said as we signed the paperwork in her living room. "Starting over at our age takes real courage." If she only knew what kind of courage I was really displaying. I worked with 3 different investment firms to avoid creating obvious patterns. I used my maiden name for some transactions, my married name for others. I structured deals through LLCs, through trusts, through every legal mechanism my team of advisors could devise. The board members at Meridian were so eager for investment capital that they barely questioned where my money came from. A recently divorced woman with a sudden interest in business ownership? How wonderful that I was taking charge of my life and building financial independence. They saw exactly what I wanted them to see. A woman seeking stability and passive income after a life upheaval. They had no idea they were selling control of their company to someone who'd been studying their every move, their every weakness, their every opportunity for improvement. The day I reached 51% ownership was a Tuesday. In November. I remember it perfectly because I'd been tracking every percentage point, every share, every dollar for months. I sat in my study that evening looking at the legal documents that confirmed my majority control and allowed myself 1 glass of very expensive champagne. I was now the controlling shareholder of the company where my ex-husband worked, where he'd been telling people about his important position and his bright future, where he probably felt safe, successful. beyond the reach of the woman he deemed without spark. The board meeting where I revealed my position was scheduled for a Thursday morning. I chose my outfit carefully: a navy blue suit that projected authority without aggression, pearl earrings that suggested tradition and stability, and the kind of understated confidence that comes from holding all the cards. I arrived early and took my seat at the mahogany conference table where decisions about the company's future were made. The same table where my ex-husband had probably sat through countless meetings, never imagining that his ex-wife would one day be sitting at its head. When the other board members filed in, I could see the confusion on their faces. They knew we had a new major investor joining the meeting, but they clearly hadn't expected me. "Gentlemen," I said, looking around the table at the 7 men who'd been running Meridian according to their old-fashioned playbook. "I believe some introductions are in order. I'm Helena Duarte, and as of yesterday, I hold controlling interest in this company." The silence that followed was deafening. Harold Morrison, the CEO, Cynthia's husband, the one whose wife had suggested I become a nurse, shifted uncomfortably in his chair. His face went through several color changes as the implications sank in. "Mrs. Duarte," he finally managed, "we appreciate your investment, but perhaps you'd prefer a more passive role while you adjust to your new circumstances." My new circumstances. As if being free of a faithless husband was something to recover from rather than celebrate. "Actually," I said, placing my documents on the table with deliberate precision, "I'll be taking a very active role, starting with a complete organizational review." What followed was 2 hours of the most professionally satisfying conversation of my life. I'd done my homework. I knew their profit margins, their market opportunities, their operational inefficiencies. I'd studied their competition, analyzed their customer base, identified areas for growth that they'd been ignoring. These men had been running Meridian like a comfortable old boys club, more concerned with maintaining the status quo than with maximizing potential. They'd been leaving money on the table, opportunities unexplored, because change required effort and vision. I outlined my plans for restructuring, new policies that would improve efficiency, new hiring practices that would bring in fresh talent, new partnerships that would expand their market reach. I kept everyone who worked hard and delivered results. The dedicated managers, the innovative staff members, the people who actually made the company run. But I restructured everything else. New hierarchies that rewarded performance over seniority, new reporting, structures that increased accountability, new standards that would push everyone to excel, and one new position, executive assistant to the CEO. The job posting was crafted with surgical precision, recent graduate preferred, excellent organizational skills required, ability to handle high-pressure situations essential, experience with confidential document management a plus. It was posted on a Friday afternoon. By Monday morning, Isabella Rodriguez had submitted her application. Her resume was perfect. Recent MBA from a good school, excellent grades, internship experience at a consulting firm, and absolutely no idea what she was walking into. The cover letter was well-written, professional, eager, exactly what you'd expect from an ambitious young woman starting her career. I scheduled her interview for the following Thursday afternoon. I knew Marcus would be in the building, as they always had his weekly status meetings on Thursdays, usually running long because he liked to hold court, to feel important. That morning, I prepared like a general preparing for battle. I chose my office setup carefully, the chair positioned to project authority, the lighting flattering but professional, the documents arranged to suggest competence and control. When she walked into my office at 2 p.m. sharp, I saw exactly what Marcus had fallen for. Youth, certainly, but also intelligence, ambition, that bright-eyed confidence that comes from never having been truly tested by life's cruelties. She was beautiful, yes, but in the way that all young people are beautiful, unmarked by disappointment, unbroken by betrayal, still believing that the world would reward her simply for trying hard and meaning well. "Ms. Rodriguez," I said, standing behind my desk to establish the dynamic. From the first moment. "Thank you for coming in." She smiled that practiced smile, the one she probably used on professors and authority figures, the one that had likely opened doors for her throughout her charmed life. "Thank you for the opportunity, Mrs. Helena Duarte, CEO of Meridian." Holdings. I let that sink in for a moment, watching her face for any sign of recognition. Please, have a seat. And then I began the most elaborate job interview of my career. The interview lasted 45 minutes, though it felt like both an eternity and an instant. Isabella Rodriguez was intelligent, I'll give her that. She answered my questions with the kind of thoughtful precision that comes from excellent education and natural aptitude. When I asked about her experience with complex scheduling, she provided specific examples. When I inquired about her ability to handle confidential information, she referenced her internship work with sensitive client data. She was exactly the kind of employee any company would want. Bright, eager, professional, and completely unaware that she was being interviewed for a position in a very personal chess game. Tell me about your long-term career goals, I said, leaning back in my chair and studying her carefully. I want to build a career in strategic business management, she replied, her eyes bright with ambition. I believe that starting in an executive support role will give me insight into how successful companies operate from the ground up. Strategic business management. How perfectly she'd positioned herself in Marcus's life, not just as a pretty young thing, but as someone who shared his professional interests, who could talk about quarterly reports and market analysis over dinner. And what attracts you? Specifically to Meridian Holdings? I asked. The company has strong fundamentals but clear opportunities for growth, she said, probably reciting something Marcus had told her. I'd love to be part of a team that's positioned for expansion. I almost smiled at that. She had no idea how much expansion was about to happen, or how dramatically her role in it would change. The position comes with significant responsibility, I explained, opening the folder that contained her job description. You'd be working directly with our senior management team, coordinating schedules, managing sensitive documents, facilitating communication between departments. I paused, watching her face carefully. Including some people you might find familiar. That's when he knocked on my door. 2 sharp raps, followed immediately by the door opening. Marcus had never been good at waiting for permission. It was one of the things that had annoyed me throughout our marriage, this assumption that his presence was always welcome, his input always needed. Helena, I need to discuss the quarterly. He stopped mid-sentence when he saw Isabella sitting across from my desk. The color drained from his face so quickly I thought he might faint. His eyes moved from me to her, then back to me, then to her again, as if his brain couldn't process what he was seeing. 20 years of confidence, of certainty, of control over his environment, evaporated in the span of a heartbeat. I don't believe you've met our newest team member, I said, my voice perfectly calm, perfectly professional. Isabella Rodriguez, our new executive assistant. Isabella, this is Marcus Duarte, Senior Vice President of Operations. The silence that followed was magnificent. It stretched between us like a taut wire, vibrating with tension and unspoken implications. Isabella looked confused, probably wondering why the energy in the room had suddenly become thick enough to cut with a knife. She glanced between Marcus and me, clearly sensing the undercurrents but unable to identify their source. Marcus looked like a man watching his carefully constructed worlds collide in the most catastrophic way possible. His mouth opened and closed without sound, like a fish pulled from water. I wasn't aware we were hiring, he finally managed to say, his voice hoarse with shock. Many things have changed. Recently, I replied, maintaining eye contact with him while speaking to Isabella. We're expanding our executive support staff to better serve our growing business needs. I gestured for him to sit down. Please join us. I was just explaining Isabella's new responsibilities. What followed was the most professionally brutal 20 minutes of my life. I outlined her duties with surgical precision, each task designed to give her unprecedented access to the inner workings of our business. And to Marcus's professional life. She would coordinate schedules for all senior staff members, including approval for vacation requests, travel arrangements, and meeting priorities. She would have access to confidential documents, financial reports, strategic planning materials. She would manage communications between departments, screening calls, and emails for executive staff. She would, essentially, have a front row seat to watch her boyfriend's professional life unfold under the complete control of the woman he'd discarded. The position also involves some discretionary responsibilities, I continued, pulling out a contract I'd had prepared that morning. Monitoring of expense reports, for instance. Ensuring that company resources are being used appropriately. Marcus's face went white at that. He knew, as I knew, that his expense account from the past year would not bear close scrutiny. All those business dinners that had been dates, the hotel rooms charged to the company card, during supposed business trips, the conference registrations that didn't match any actual professional development. The salary is quite competitive, I told Isabella, naming a figure that made her eyes widen, and that was deliberately higher than Marcus's current compensation. We believe in investing in talented young people. Isabella's professionalism was admirable. Even sensing the strange dynamics in the room, she maintained her composure, asked intelligent questions about the role, demonstrated exactly the kind of emotional intelligence that would serve her well in navigating whatever this situation turned out to be. Marcus said nothing. What could he say? That hiring his girlfriend was inappropriate? That I was being unprofessional? That this was all too convenient to be coincidence? Any objection would require him to admit their relationship, and any admission would create exactly the kind of workplace complication that could cost him his job, his reputation, his carefully crafted image as a serious business professional. I'd given him an impossible choice: accept the situation and watch his personal and professional lives become inextricably intertwined under my control, or expose himself as someone who'd pursued a personal relationship with a job candidate, potentially destroying both his career and hers. Either way, I won. When can you start? I asked Isabella. Monday would be perfect, she said, still processing the strange undercurrents, but smart. Enough to recognize an incredible opportunity when she saw one. Excellent, I said, standing to shake her hand. Marcus, I trust you'll help Isabella get acclimated to our company culture. After she left, promising to arrive Monday morning at 8 a.m. sharp, Marcus and I sat alone in my office. The room felt smaller somehow, weighted with everything unsaid, everything that had just changed forever. He stared at me like he was seeing me for the first time. Maybe he was. How long have you been planning this? He asked finally. Planning what? I asked innocently. Expanding our business? Hiring qualified staff? Building something meaningful with my life? I shrugged, as if the question itself was absurd. I've always been good at long-term thinking, Marcus. You taught me that. The irony wasn't lost on either of us. He'd spent years dismissing my contributions to our business partnership, treating my strategic input as minor, my analysis as cute but irrelevant. Now he was discovering exactly how good I'd become at strategy. Helena. Mrs. Duarte. I corrected gently. We should maintain professional boundaries, don't you think? It's important for workplace morale. He sat there for another minute, probably trying to find some angle, some way to regain control of the situation. But there wasn't one. I'd planned too well, moved too carefully, positioned myself too strategically. Finally, he stood up and walked to the door. This isn't over, he said quietly. I smiled at him. Then, the first genuine smile I'd given him since that day in our living room when he'd told me I'd lost my spark. You're absolutely right, I said. It's just beginning. After he left, I sat alone in my office and allowed myself a moment of pure satisfaction. Not because I'd hurt him, though I had. Not because I'd gained control, though I had that too. But because I'd discovered something profound about myself. I was not the woman he'd married. I was not even the woman he'd divorced. I was someone entirely new. Someone who could plan and execute and control outcomes in ways I'd never imagined possible. Someone who'd been underestimated for the last time. The next 6 months were a masterclass in psychological warfare, disguised as impeccable corporate management. Every morning at 7:45 a.m., I would arrive at the office and watch through my window as Isabella pulled into the parking lot. She drove a modest sedan, probably still paying student loans, probably living in a small apartment and carefully budgeting her new salary. Every morning at 8 a.m. sharp, she would knock on my door with my coffee, prepared exactly how I liked it, though I'd never told her my preferences. She'd figured it out by observation, by attention to detail, by the kind of thoughtful competence that made her genuinely good at her job. And every morning, Marcus would arrive at 8:15, walking past Isabella's desk on his way to his office, forced to greet his girlfriend with professional courtesy. While knowing that every word, every glance, every interaction was potentially being observed and analyzed by the woman who now controlled both their professional lives. I wasn't cruel. I want to be clear about that. I never made their relationship a direct issue. I never acknowledged it existed at all. I maintained perfect professional boundaries, treating Isabella exactly as I would any highly competent executive assistant, treating Marcus exactly as I would any senior vice president whose performance was under constant evaluation. But the situation itself was exquisite torture for him. He had to watch Isabella develop genuine respect for me, had to listen to her talk about what an inspiring leader I was, how much she was learning, how grateful she was for the opportunity to work with someone who took her seriously and invested in her professional development. Mrs. Duarte has such strategic vision, she told him one evening. I know because I could hear them talking in his office after hours, their voices carrying through the thin walls of our executive floor. She's teaching me to think about business in completely new ways. Isabella was a quick learner, and I was a good teacher. I began including her in strategic planning meetings, explaining my reasoning behind decisions, helping her understand the complex calculations that went into major business choices. She had excellent instincts, and under proper mentorship, she flourished in ways that a simple romantic relationship never could have encouraged. Within 2 months, she was contributing ideas that improved our operations. She identified inefficiencies in our scheduling system that saved us thousands of dollars annually. She suggested a client communication protocol that increased customer satisfaction scores by 15%. She was becoming the kind of professional she'd always had the potential to be. And I could see Marcus struggling with the cognitive dissonance of watching his girlfriend thrive under the guidance of his ex-wife. The real psychological pressure came from the constant, subtle reminders of his changed circumstances. In meetings, I would defer to Isabella's expertise on scheduling and logistics, asking her opinion in front of the entire senior staff. Isabella, what's your assessment of our capacity for the Peterson project timeline? I would include her name on important emails, copying her on strategic communications that Marcus wasn't privy to. Please coordinate with Isabella Rodriguez, executive assistant, regarding implementation details. I restructured our office hierarchy so that certain administrative decisions that affected Marcus's daily work had to go through Isabella's desk. Nothing inappropriate, nothing that crossed professional boundaries, but a constant daily reminder that the woman he was sleeping with was now positioned as a gatekeeper to resources he needed to do his job effectively. The most elegant part was that none of it was personal. Every decision I made was justifiable on business grounds. Isabella genuinely was becoming indispensable to our operations. The new reporting structures genuinely did improve efficiency. The expanded responsibilities I gave her genuinely did warrant her increased authority. But Marcus knew what was happening, and I knew he knew. 3 months into Isabella's employment, she came to my office with a concerned expression and a folder in her hands. Mrs. Duarte, she said, I've been reviewing the expense reports from the previous quarter, and I noticed some irregularities. She handed me a file containing Marcus's expense account, meticulously documented and cross-referenced. Business dinners that looked suspiciously like romantic dates, hotel rooms charged to the company card during supposed business trips, conference registrations that didn't match any actual professional development, events. He'd been using company funds to court her. I could have destroyed him with this information. One call to our legal department, one formal complaint to the board, and his career would have been over. He could have faced criminal charges for embezzlement. Instead, I called him to my office. We need to discuss some financial discrepancies, I said, placing Isabella's report on my desk between us. He knew immediately what I'd found. The color drained from his face, then returned in a rush of red embarrassment, then settled into the gray pallor of a man who realizes he's been completely outmaneuvered. Helena, Mrs. Duarte, I corrected automatically. I'm going to give you a choice, Marcus. I leaned back in my chair, studying his face as I spoke. You can reimburse the company for these inappropriate expenses, the full amount, with interest calculated at prime plus 2%. You can submit a formal letter of apology to the board acknowledging your poor judgment in mixing personal and professional finances. And you can accept a salary reduction that reflects your new understanding of appropriate professional boundaries. I paused, letting him process the terms. Or I can Let our legal team handle this through proper channels. They're very thorough, and they tend to take corporate financial irregularities quite seriously. And what about... He glanced toward the outer office where Isabella worked. What about what? I asked innocently. Your work relationship with, our executive assistant. I expect you to maintain appropriate professional standards with all staff members. That shouldn't be difficult for someone in your position. He chose the first option, of course. The salary reduction put him below Isabella's pay grade, a fact that would be reflected in our annual compensation reports. The formal apology became part of his permanent personnel file. The reimbursement required him to liquidate investments and drain his savings account. But the real punishment was subtler and more prolonged. It was watching me rebuild myself into someone stronger, smarter, more successful than I'd ever been while married to him. Seeing me command respect in boardrooms, close deals he couldn't have imagined, build partnerships with companies that had previously ignored Meridian Holdings. It was witnessing Isabella's respect for me grow as she learned what real leadership looked like, what it meant to be guided by someone who saw her potential and invested in developing it, rather than simply enjoying it. It was the daily reality of working for the woman he'd dismissed as without spark, and discovering that she'd been building something magnificent while he was distracted by temporary pleasures. Every morning when he said, "Good morning, Mrs. Duarte," I could hear the subtle weight of recognition in his voice. Every time he had to acknowledge my authority in meetings, every time he had to implement decisions I'd made, every time he had to watch Isabella thrive under my mentorship. It was a small daily reminder of exactly what he'd thrown away. And the most beautiful part? Isabella never knew the full extent of what was happening. She simply experienced what it felt like to work for someone who believed in her capabilities, who challenged her to grow, who treated her as a professional rather than as an ornament. She became the woman she'd always had the potential to become. And Marcus got to watch it happen, knowing that he'd never encouraged that growth, never seen that potential, never offered that kind of meaningful partnership. He'd wanted inspiration. Now he got to see what real inspiration looked like, and recognize that he'd never been capable of providing it. A year later, Isabella came to my office with an envelope in her hands and an expression I'd never seen before, a mixture of gratitude, sadness, and determined confidence. "Mrs. Duarte," she said, sitting across from my desk in the same chair where she'd interviewed 12 months earlier. "I have something to give you." She handed me her resignation letter. The letter was beautifully written, professional, and heartfelt. She thanked me for the opportunity, for the mentorship, for believing in her potential when she was just starting her career. She outlined the skills she'd developed, the confidence she'd gained, the clarity she'd found about her professional goals. "I've learned so much here," she said, her voice steady but emotional. "But I think it's time for me to find my own path. I've been accepted to a graduate program in international business, and I've also received an offer from Morrison Strategic Consulting. I want to build something of my own." I wasn't surprised. I'd seen it coming for months, the way she'd grown into her role, the way she'd started asking different kinds of questions, the way she'd begun to look beyond Meridian Holdings toward larger opportunities. "And Marcus?" I asked gently. She looked uncomfortable for the first time in our conversation, her professional composure wavering slightly. "We ended things several months ago," she said carefully. "I realized we wanted different things, very different things. Different things." How diplomatically she put it. What she'd really realized, though she was too gracious to say it directly, was that she deserved better than being someone's midlife crisis. That she was worth more than being a consolation prize for a man who'd proven he could discard decades of partnership for temporary excitement. She'd learned what I'd hoped she would learn, that real strength comes from standing on your own merit, not from being someone's accessory. That true partnership requires mutual respect, shared values, and a commitment to growing together rather than simply enjoying each other's company. Marcus had offered her youth and beauty, excitement and novelty, but he'd never offered her growth, challenge, or the kind of partnership that could sustain a lifetime. "He's a good person," she said diplomatically, "but he's looking for something I can't give him, and I've discovered I need something he can't provide." She'd grown up during her year at Meridian Holdings, not just professionally, but personally. She'd learned to value her own intelligence, to trust her own judgment, to recognize her own worth in ways that went far beyond her appeal to middle-aged men going through predictable transitions. "I hope you understand," she continued. "This isn't about you or about the company. It's about me finally figuring out who I want to become." I stood up and walked around my desk to shake her hand. Not the handshake of an employer and employee, but the handshake of one professional woman to another. "Isabella," I said, "I couldn't be prouder of the woman you've become. You're going to accomplish extraordinary things." She smiled. Then, and I saw in her face the confidence that comes from knowing your own value, from understanding that you don't need anyone else's approval to be worthy of respect and opportunity. After she left, Marcus requested a meeting. He knocked on my door that same afternoon, looking older somehow, more tired than I remembered. "I'd like to request a transfer to our satellite office," he said without preamble, "for a fresh start." I approved it immediately, not out of kindness, but because I no longer needed him close by to prove my point. I'd proven it. The satellite office was in Minneapolis, a smaller operation, less prestigious, fewer opportunities for advancement. It wasn't a punishment exactly, but it was a natural consequence of the choices he'd made. "Marcus," I said as he prepared to leave my office for what we both knew would be the last time, "I want you to know something." He paused at the door, probably expecting some final confrontation, some moment of dramatic revelation or vindictive triumph. "I forgive you," I said simply. His face went through several expressions: surprise, confusion, something that might have been relief. "Not for your sake," I continued, "but for mine. Carrying anger would have diminished what I've built here, and what I've built is too important to be corrupted by bitterness." He nodded slowly, understanding perhaps for the first time the magnitude of what he'd lost and what I'd gained. "Helena," he said quietly. Mrs. Duarte," I corrected one final time. "But Marcus, I hope you find what you're looking for. I genuinely do." And I meant it. Not because I'd stopped caring about the pain he'd caused, but because I'd discovered something more powerful than revenge. I'd discovered my own capacity for building something meaningful, something lasting, something entirely my own. After he left, I sat alone in my office, in my company, surrounded by the success I'd built not in spite of his betrayal, but because of what it had taught me about my own capabilities. My name is Helena Duarte. I'm 49 now, and I learned that true strength isn't in screaming, but in surviving with dignity. When the world tried to break me, I rebuilt myself. Not with anger, but with intelligence. Not with revenge, but with purpose. Each scar tells a story. Each silent tear was an act of resistance. Stories like mine need to be told. Not to encourage bitterness, but to show that no woman needs to accept being discarded. That dignity isn't about staying quiet. It's about getting smart, getting strategic, and getting everything you deserve. Every betrayal was a lesson. Every underestimation, an opportunity for growth. And if you were in my place, how would you react? I didn't come into this world to be invisible. I came to leave my mark, even when they tried to erase my existence. My voice is my weapon, my story, my revolution. When they told me I was finished, I proved I was just beginning. When they tried to silence me, I spoke louder, not with words, but with actions that echoed through boardrooms and changed lives. Today, I run 3 companies. I mentor young women entering business, teaching them to recognize their worth and demand respect. I invest in female-led startups, providing not just capital, but guidance from someone who understands what it means to build something from nothing. And every time someone calls me ma'am, I smile. Because I finally learned what it means to be a woman in her prime. Not because someone else desires me, but because I desire my own success, my own growth, my own magnificent, uncompromising future. At 49, I discovered something beautiful. There's nothing more dangerous than a woman who's been underestimated and has nothing left to lose except the limitations others tried to place on her. Because true strength isn't in screaming. It's in surviving, with dignity and then thriving beyond anyone's expectations, especially your own.